Welcome everybody to Friday Lunch and Learn. And today we have a special speaker. It's Yannick Ruiz. It's his part two, and we also part one, and we're excitedly waiting to see part two. It all starts with energy, which is similar to a presentation I made on energy about the brain. And Yannick picked some of that up and said, well, we can apply that to the body too, and how should we look at it? So he's going to present uh, that today. And without further ado, I'll let Yannick take over.
All right, thank you very much, Richard. So this is going to be the second part of It All Starts With Energy, and it's going to have a special focus on salt. So not just salt, but also the path to energy, motivation, and away from addiction, because there is a very strong connection between both. And that's what we're going to jump into. So we had already seen last time, but I wanted to go back to it a little bit, that selection is ignorance. So when you select something, you choose to ignore something else, and then you have this central value, and that's what you're going to be fixating and focusing on. But when you see things from different perspectives, you can reintegrate it and use it in a different way. And it is not as limiting as just focusing on one single level of observation. So shifting from human-centric to a field view, which integrates humans with the whole, which would be nature, and calling this more the true organism environment, which is there is interaction, constant interaction between us, the ecology, and the environment, and that's where we can find a richer interpretation of behavior and what to do about it. So starting from the 6 stages of illness, the mindset and the interaction of the world is just where we're about to start. So we can really apply it to our lifestyle and improve our health. So what I'm going for in this presentation is a little bit more of that paradigm shift. Last time we reviewed how energy is absorbed by water. Solar energy is actually the true source of um, uh, the initiation of all metabolic activities by structuring water. Grounding is also a big one, but those two are not being used now. So we are having a lot of lack of health, and the paradigm shift will now go into electrolytes, particularly salt. So when we talk about salt, this image really shows us how there are different types of salts, and the composition is very different to what we have been led to believe, or the one that we use the most, which is table salt. So real salt contains sodium, contains chloride, and it contains dozens of minerals. This is what processed salt is composed of. Just contains sodium, chloride, aluminum, dextrose, and some iodide. But it really has nothing to do with whole salts. So this would be the equivalent of a processed food like refined flours versus whole foods. You can just see the amount of minerals it contains, even potassium and magnesium, which are very important, and sulfur. So the relationships, the ratios are completely different. Doesn't matter if it's mine salt or if it's sea salt. In either case, there is more of a proportion, and it is not void of potassium and magnesium, which we know are so important, just to name a couple of minerals. Visually, you can also see it. It's extremely different in general. And also to start pointing out that you will have hormone shifts depending on your salt status. So when you have low sodium, you actually have these hormones that stiffen up your arteries and they retain sodium, and they also increase your blood pressure. So salt restriction or being low on salt, as in salt deficiency, can start producing these effects through hormones. There's this other hormone that has a very important impact on electrolytes. So cortisol releases sodium from our skin to help us during times of stress. So stress meaning when we're supposed to perform something, we have to carry out physical activity. And it also helps with our pH balance after the stress-inducing event, because these types of hormones linger on for longer than an immediate response from an event. So that way you can go back into homeostasis. The problem we find now is that people are chronically stressed out and cortisol levels, well, they're predominant. And that's what actually induces many difficulties. So these are some salty facts that the body can excrete huge amounts of excess sodium, but not excess sugar, because there's always this worry about, oh, you know, your kidneys are going to be having trouble with it. But, you know, normal functioning kidneys can excrete up to 100 grams of salt. So those are huge amounts. Now, salt does not cause over retention of water. It's important to have a balance between water and salt, potassium, magnesium being others, but just to have an idea that there's also a balance in how much we should be having of each. Now, salt retaining hormones, as I mentioned, can impact your organs, and they can also cause hypertension. Can increase your heart rate and size, and they'll stiffen your arteries. And we already know from the previous slide that that comes from salt restriction, as in the case with aldosterone. This is also another example of a study which is focusing more on chloride, because when everyone talks about salt, they're talking about sodium. And they're not even talking about the other mineral that's predominant, which is chloride, which is incredibly important. So this is an example of how low levels of chloride can actually impact your neural hormone activation. Neural hormone are just hormones that are created in the brain that work within the brain in general, as opposed to other types of hormones that, you know, go farther into the bloodstream and have impacts really far in the body, like cortisol or aldosterone. But this is an example of how even chloride supplementation can improve your state and not lead into heart failure. Now, salt restriction and deficiencies cause something called pica cribbing when we talk about livestock, and in humans, we call it munchies. So animals will start licking and biting and chewing on wood, metal, and anything they can find. And those aren't the only animals that start showing a certain type of behavior. You can just see that elephants in Kenya, well, it's been observed that they go into these dark caves, these pitch dark caves, and they start licking the walls that contain sodium sulfate. There are also elephants in other parts that uproot trees and they start getting at the sodium-rich soil, as well as gorillas that follow those elephants and start also eating off the salt-rich soil and also start chewing on rotting wood because it's full of salty microbes. So you can just see how critical and how important these two electrolytes are. I mean, we have very few differentiation taste buds, And there are only two that will tell you about two critically essential minerals. It's not that potassium isn't important, or magnesium isn't important, or calcium, or bicarbonates, but it means that these two are so extremely important that you have to have a sensory signaling system. And even in livestock, it's been known that if you want the animals to start eating their minerals, you have to salt it. So they have these big salt blocks to start getting their essential minerals and stop with the pica behavior and the cribbing and the munchies. And that's also a tip for parents trying to get their kids to eat more vegetables or nuts or seeds. Salt them and you will have a lot more success. Well, that's how you can apply what's been learned in the livestock industry with humans. Now, going into an evolutionary perspective and the adaptive value of consuming salt can also be very useful. So this is a study about the stomach acidity and the relevance to the human microbiome, which means you want to have a balanced out, healthy gut microbe diversity. High acidity is really important. And as you can see on this chart, we're right there in between the carnivores, the generalist carnivores and the specialist carnivores. So we are omnivores, we are highly carnivorous, and we need high acidity to break down food. And by doing so, it's also a type of defense against bacteria. So if we really want to sterilize our stomach and be protected, cooking has become a necessity, but before it was impossible, or it couldn't be done frequently. But salt would be the key electrolyte and couple of minerals that would help you with this. Besides, if you don't have chloride, you can't produce any hydrochloric acid, which is a stomach acid. So it's a building block. If you don't have enough, you'll be in trouble. So when you understand this and know how much H. pylori impacts you, this is known in the functional medicine world that H. pylori can really start affecting you in so many ways, and it's very, you need antibiotics and you need to break down their microfilm to get at them and be able to, just kill them, and so you have good functionality. But if you had always used certain amounts of salt, the proper ones, then it is harder for you to have these type of infections. So by doing this, this is also another example of how this limited idea of sodium will give you high blood pressure, and then you'll have damage to your arteries just because of that is like not really well thought of. For example, by having an infection of H. pylori, you can start having openings in your tight junctions in your stomach lining, and that sends endotoxins, which are toxins from these bacteria, right into your bloodstream. And that can also be an independent risk factor for atherosclerosis. So we can also view it from another evolutionary perspective on sudden dehydration. So salt has these cooling mechanisms by temporarily increasing your blood volume, and that way you can have resilience versus heat strokes or increased temperature. Doesn't matter if it's environmental or if you're carrying out some really heavy physical activity or exercise, that's how it helps. and ultimately that'll lead to improved adaptation, passing along your genes and having more offspring and allowing the species to go on. So it has also been known that monkeys that groom each other, they also start eating at the skin secretions. So it's not just a social aspect that they're showing, a type of caress, like humans do it much more verbally now, but with other types of primates, they get benefits. And one of them is being able to get some extra salt. And if you add some more salt into their fur, like put it on, then the grooming increases. So that's also a way of measuring the observations and knowing if it's significantly relevant. Now, salt deficiency will impose a handicap. As mentioned before, you can overheat, your speed's reduced, your power outputs reduce. So when it comes to speed and endurance, it can be the difference between becoming prey or surviving. Now, thermoregulation is also very important when it comes to fertility. If you have high temperature or really low, it will be impacting your fertility. This has been known with different herbivores, and it's also just pretty much a no-brainer because if we don't have the right temperature, our brain function goes down, our hormones go out of whack, and it's a lot harder for our body. So if you consume more salt, predators consume more salt, they will have the edge as well. And we know that animal meat contains a lot of salt, and mostly the skin, the interstitial tissue, as well as the organs, they contain higher amounts of all these electrolytes. And that's why salt has a critical adaptive value for survival. Now, Aborigines would eat between 2 to 3 kilograms of meat per sitting during a kill, which are very high amounts. And that's pretty much the equivalent of what many Americans consume of sodium per day if they're not trying to restrict it and following the guidelines. Also, the organs of animals they're higher in salt than meat. The skin, the blood, the bone marrow, it also contains salt. You can also see that there's a lot more electrolytes in their interstitial fluid than there is over here in the plasma, the blood plasma. So we used to eat the entire animal. We're not doing that anymore. So it's a lot more difficult for the body to be able to balance out the pH. We would also be consuming natural mineral water besides all those other animal parts, as well as fruits and tubers. So high bicarbonate consumption is also very important to generate energy and for our pH balance. If we remember from last presentation, everything we drink will impact us. So it's not the same to drink from tap water than it is from the streams in a river, which contains different information and minerals. It is completely different. Also, water burning requires bicarbonates in the blood, and that's one of the reasons why baking soda is such a useful universal remedy. As shown with the example I provided in the last presentation of how very small amounts of sodium bicarbonate with some electromagnetic frequencies would start emitting photons and would last for more than a year. So you can just see that energy nonstop for a complete year. Now, primates have been eating fish for quite some time, and several have used tools to do so. So aquatic animals contain high salt as well as high quality nutrients like omega-3 fatty acids which was required so we could grow our brain. And same thing can be said for the maintenance of our brain. So a child that's developing needs these elements, as well as someone that's just maintaining their brain health, or someone that is having difficulties, neurogenic type of issues, or dementias. These are critical factors. Now, the bioenergetic potential of humans is much higher. The brain mass, the energy that's required, the longevity, and the reproductive output. Water burning just needs salt and energy. We saw this on last presentation. So energy generation to be able to continue performing and thinking is even more critical for us than other species, the amounts for our brain. Now, just a quick recap to remember that to build this structured water in your cells for potential energy, you need water, salt, and sunshine. And there are other forms to increase it, but those are the primary ones that everyone has at their disposal. So now, taking a historical perspective to improve performance, I thought about the Romans, because they would usually pay the army with salt, because the worth in gold, they would pay it to them, and that would have different benefits, as we already saw, in endurance and power, brain output, cardiac output, muscle function, reduction of cramps, preserving food, killing bacteria, and they would also practice going out to the sun and their sun hospitals. And well, could this partly explain the military dominance? I believe it can. So coming back to the present, for brain function, overheating the brain carries big risks. For starters, if you're overheated, then you're going to be sweating, and you're going to sweat all these minerals as well as amino acids and vitamins. This is just from 1 hour of moderate activity. These are ways how temperature can affect your brain function through neurotransmission. There are studies that show that the human brain gets harder, way harder than we used to believe, and how it impacts the synaptic transmission. And your blood-brain barrier also opens up. This is an experiment with mice. And when this happens, you also get immune activation. So it's just really bad combo to have this overheating, because it'll impact your functionality, and not just short term, but long term. Also, when you consume certain psychomotor stimulant drugs, your brain heats up a lot more than if you didn't. That means that you would require more salt to be able to reduce that amount of temperature. Now, this is a chart that I've shared before in the group about salt consumption and all-cause mortality. And this is an example of how improved salt will decrease that all-cause mortality. And the recommendations are actually not improving health. Actually, if you have low levels of salt, you will start losing calcium and magnesium, and it will just take it from your bone, because you require it to continue functioning. And a human adult requires at least 5 grams during exercise days. And I'm talking 5 grams of sodium. Remember, salt is sodium and chloride, so this is critical for bone health as well. Coffee consumption also makes you lose sodium. So caffeine and salt restriction can be a double whammy, and then you would also lose taurine, which is really important for brain function. So the salt, sugar, and addictive link has been known even with starving lab animals, so they can keep themselves motivated to try and get at food. And well, salt also being a major component. So the body has this form of signaling. It contains the taste buds for those two minerals, so you can know that you're supposed to go and get more of it until you feel satiated. The reward pathways they start increasing, so that when you start eating, you eat a lot more because you are very deficient. But this also impacts other addictive substances like sugar, because it works on the reward signaling system of the body and the dopamine neurotransmitter and receptors. So low salt, as well as other types of drugs, have a similar effect on brain activity. Low salt also creates this anxiety prone state of being. And children, babies that are born after having sodium restriction because of advice of medical practitioners, or just not having enough access to it, seems that they pass this need for more salt to their babies. And if that's happening and it's long term, as it's been observed, then we start getting addictions to sugar, to cell phones, to anything that feels rewarding. And that can lead into addiction of certain medications or drugs. And as an example, alcohol, which is another type of drug with this morphine type of effect. So sugar also causes salt depletion, and sodium restriction increases insulin resistance. So prioritizing insulin levels and blood sugar, much more important than just restricting salt. It's just not a good strategy. And when I'm talking about salt, I'm talking about whole salt, real salt. So when it comes to functional neurofeedback relevance, brain development, and plasticity, there are different types of communication. The first one, the quickest one, requires sodium. Right? It's very, very important. Then when it comes to neurotransmission, it's also going to be critical. Activation of neurons, which you can see the potassium and the sodium are critical, both, not just one. And when it comes to neurotransmission, chloride is also very important because it will help. It will change the charge just like potassium. Now, you need salt for every single neurotransmitter. And if you want to not be prone to be stimulated by every single noise, or not being able to keep your attention on something, you want to have enough salt, including chloride as well as potassium. But chloride is also plays a very important role. It's not predominant in that aspect, but it is important. So you can have this healthy brain and nerve function. Now, not reacting to everything chronically, constantly. For that, you need enough salt for that movement to take place, those different phases, and also for increasing stimulation if there is depression. Now, the coaching in cases I want to show you is that, for example, this is a veteran male on 20 medications, and you can see his cravings for chocolate, pepperoni pizza, enchiladas, meat and potatoes, salt. He didn't have balance. His hands were shaking, and from a craving of 5 and 3 to nothing after 3 teaspoons of salt, and have increase in relaxation and decrease in stress, as well as feeling more empowerment. That'll tell you how quickly it'll act. And it took about 10 minutes for this, between 10 and 15 minutes. It takes about the same time for everyone. This is the second session. You can just see the shift. I mean, he was already on the program, but he started out well, but he still required more salt. Less than the previous session, but even then, you could see the changes. And also the types of cravings. And after taking the water and salt, it was gone. This is another male, 76-year-old, that was just talking and talking, huge amount of stimulants, smoking, coffee, was 40 cigarettes a day. This is an image of the BioWell, the device that I mentioned, which is really good to show dynamic changes, systematic dynamic changes, and how you can just see the difference is a lot more energy on the cerebral cortex, well, the part that's associated with it, and the part that had a lot of inflammation just going down. Also a huge asymmetry in organs that went down after the water and salts. And a female, 34 years old, taking care of herself, but still not knowing how important salt was. You can just see the differences within the session, the decrease, and she was addicted to Coca-Cola. After that session too, 15 days later, she was off Coca-Cola. She didn't have the need for it, but she just wanted it all the time. Her hands and feet weren't purple anymore, well, type of, like palish purple. And you can see the difference in joules right here, 46 joules to 50 joules, and just have more of a continuous flow of energy throughout the entire body, including the cortex. You can also see it when it's for different organs, before more in the orange part, and after more on the green part. Functional medicine markers also improving, so you can use it in combination. And now going into the old paradigm, which are losing strength like fat and cholesterol, I just wanted to remind people that some ideas catch on. And medical allopathic doctors in those times were promoting smoking. And this is a lot of that advertisement that was going on. And you can just see how they played a really pivotal role in getting people to smoke or not stop smoking during treatment. So paradigm shift, and it takes time for that. Also requires a lot more evidence and just waiting it out. And just some key points are that there are differences between salt. Livestock receives supplementation, big cubes of salt and minerals. There's evolutionary evidence. I presented a historical proposition of evidence. Water, we need salt, we need sunshine, and if we use certain devices as well as juicing and grounding, then we can improve our energy by a lot, reduce our addictions, and just have an overall increase in functionality. So that's it. If anyone has any questions, we can now open the floor.
I have a question about, so a woman who is 70, almost 70, has really, really terrible night sweats. And she has in her history had hyponatremia to where she went unconscious, I think after I think it was after a plastic surgery or something. And I'm just wondering, because you mentioned hormones, if that might have something to do with, because nobody can figure out what the night sweats are. She's been to a ton of doctors.
Sure. So low salt levels, as I mentioned in the presentation, can lead into higher cortisol responses. And if you have prolonged cortisol, you start having blood sugar issues like low and high blood sugar, insulin resistance, and then you also start getting issues with your sex hormones. So you can't have like a hormonal soup of all of them at the same time. I mean, each one has it's like an operation mode. It's like, oh, okay, do you feel safe enough so you can recover and socialize and have fun and laugh? Or are you like pretty much on the brink of not being able even to have your heart beat? So that's where cortisol kicks in. So prolonged states of salt deficiency will lead into this, and high sugar also creates salt depletion, and it'll impact your hormones. So going for more whole salt, like Himalayan, Celtic, Redmond's, and more water and lime would be really useful. And she's probably also having difficulties with potassium. So like avocados and these types of foods can be very useful. But
You said
salt
what?
being a critical one.
Thank you.
You,
Thank you.
you said, did you say Redmond's or Redmond?
Redmond's.
What's Redmond?
It's mine salt from Utah.
Oh,
So
okay.
it also
Uh-oh.
has really good proportions of different minerals.
It's not from the Salt Lake.
No,
Yeah.
I've tried, different minerals from the Salt Lake, but I
That
think
thing's
it contains
toxic.
a little bit too much lead. So
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
got more lead in it. It's really
Okay.
toxic.
yeah.
My questions, which I typed somewhere, but anyway, how does coffee deplete sodium? And what's the workaround?
Well, coffee being a stimulant to do more because you have a lot of work or whatever, and you have to continue thinking. It does have an effect, but a stimulating effect. But then you lose salt because you start wasting some sodium. So for every 4 cups of coffee, you need about half a teaspoon extra of salt in water. So that's how it starts impacting. And also your kidneys don't reabsorb taurine, which is an amino acid. So your body can make it, but it becomes conditional. So supplementation with it is really helpful. Everything we
So you,
saw at the end of for neurotransmission and this taurine has a really strong impact there.
so you should take your taurine an hour before your cup of coffee.
It would be about, in between meals, at least an hour before would be good. Yeah,
Good.
that's good enough.
Good. I can
Mm.
keep doing what I was doing. Oh, do you have any idea what Starbucks started adding olive oil to their coffee and then they pulled it? But what was the deal with that? Other than olive oil is good for you.
I don't know, but olive oil will, I mean, when you're using these amounts of oil and need big storage to be able to cover the demand of Starbucks, olive oil actually burns, it oxidizes. So then you got these peroxidized oils and they go into your body and you're in trouble. I mean, it's not like freshly pressed. So it's really not healthy. Or even cooking with it, you shouldn't be cooking with olive oil because it's like, oh yeah, it still has some antioxidants and it'll, it may be able to hold out, but it's like, why would you do that? Just go for ghee and problem solved, and use olive oil when it's cold on salads, because if not, it becomes rancid. And if it's old, same story.
So I guess when you open any bottle of olive oil, you should taste it, and if it's burning your mouth, take it back.
It's really difficult to know if it's good or bad, if it's not even diluted, because there's a big thing with that also in the industry. So
But I mean,
even
but if
like
there's
stuff.
a mouth burn, that means it's bad. It kind of burns your throat, your mouth.
Well, that might be, one of the effects, but how much of it is burnt and how much isn't, it starts going into that part. And if you absorb the burnt part, either way, it goes into your cell membranes and it becomes really troubling. So yeah, olive oil is not one of my go-tos, but if I do get it, always in the fridge and, get it extra virgin pressed and just like every 6 months, get a new one.
Got it. Thanks.
You're welcome.
You can check Consumers Lab for who produces fresh olive oil too. That's not highly oxidized and really good quality.
Any names come to mind?
No, not offhand, but they have it listed. I could list them, I suppose.
Please.
Okay.
On the question on getting sunlight, I think the Germans require office workers to have windows. They don't put them in carrels, but so any particular types of windows to avoid that are kind of filtering out sunlight, or should they be open windows?
Well, if you can open them, that's better, right? Get the direct sunlight. If it's not too hot, if it's
Yeah.
sun's on top of your head, then that's not a good time. But other moments are really good. So just getting at least going out and getting real sunlight would be the best way. And the other well, what else you can do is just like design the building or have windows. This is also very important in hospitals, but kind of like forgotten how to do this stuff or why it's relevant.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, I think we're starting to, there's a lot of people starting to catch on that the way that things are being built and direction, which before were really important, well, they're even more important now because our health depends on it, and even your performance in the office. But just going out there, rolling up your sleeves at least, and getting some real sunlight, even if it's 5 to 10 minutes, having a 5 to 10 minutes break would be the best thing.
It's interesting because I was watching the Netflix, or at least one episode of 100 Years of Silence.
Mm-hmm.
And they were at the point where they were building the little village or establishing it since they couldn't find their way out of the swamp to the ocean, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, the socialist thread in it was that every hut that was built had to have access to the water that was nearby, and it had to get equal amounts of sunlight. So nobody blocked somebody else's sunlight. They were all sort of facing the same direction. It was interesting little piece that caught my ear.
Well, it definitely it makes sense from a functional perspective. Don't block somebody else's sunlight.
Yeah.
Just like those huge buildings, if they're blocking all the light on those small houses, well, it's going to be really bad for health.
They're blocking Central Park in New York. So anyway.
There you have it.
I guess I was wondering if Marquez was up on the literature, or the Aboriginals that he was basing it on were ahead of they knew more than we do.
Well, even the Romans knew more, and the Egyptians seem to know more in that aspect. So we're kind of like going for the technological golden calf, and like saying, oh yeah, this can fix everything. Well, no, it can't. You need a little bit more nature and things that we used to have that we're not getting enough of. That no amount of energy can fix it. I mean, some can help, like the machines for structuring water. They're useful, but they can't replace sunlight either way. It's more of this integrative, holistic approach of, hey, get all these, not just nutrients, but just ecological signals and interact with everything. It's more like a transaction, really, not just like us seeing out, but working two ways.
Follow the elephants into the cave. Well, they might be going there because the tsunami's coming too.
Oh yeah, it's so interesting to see natural, in natural environments, how animals behave, which is one of the main focuses in ethology. It's like, okay, what would you do under natural circumstances? I mean, we can't know that with humans. We can get a little bit closer by seeing so-called primitive groups or tribes, but it's not even then is it like as natural as it would be. But I mean, they're not dying of cardiovascular diseases all the time or anything, you know. So but yeah.
Unless we're
Mhm.
unless we're feeding them corporate canned dog food.
Oh yeah, and sending them some vaccines, some extra vaccines, which they may not need. Maybe some, maybe not others, you know, but just using them for experimentation. Oh my God. But yeah, you know what? Just like key takeaways are the amount of salt we're ingesting, it's not the right salt, it's not enough. We're also not getting enough water, and the major stimulant in the United States, coffee, depletes you even more. So long term, it's potentially damaging your nerves as well as your overall function and, you know, resilience, resistance, endurance, everything, you name it.
Okay, well, Yannick, thanks for a very informative presentation. And thank you for the questions, everybody, and participating. It's very enriching for all of us.
All right, well, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.